Shall we pray? Dear Almighty God, we thank you for another Sabbath closer to returning home. We pray, mighty God, though we have many blessings down here on this earth, we also have many issues, whether they're our own or those that we see around us and the pain that is caused. And we pray, we do want more time so everybody that you have called and chosen can make it back home, but we also really do want to get off this earth. So I pray, Lord, that you will give us patience, you will give us the heart of Jesus, you will help us to stay strong and as we're in the world but not be of it, and always be looking upwards, the kingdom of heaven. I pray that you will continue to bless us on this Sabbath day as it's coming to a close, and I pray that you will bless the presenter. We thank you for all the bounty of blessings you give us all. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Natalie. As always, this study will be interactive, and I'll have the chat and list of names up, but sometimes I may lose focus on that, and so won't be able to see raised hands. So if your hand is up and enough time passes and I haven't recognized you, please feel free to speak up. But please wait for whoever is speaking to finish their thought or what they're saying before you interject. But I do welcome that nonetheless. The contributions that would be made. So over the last few weeks, we've been going through different elements of the same topic and looking at it through different lenses to see if we can get a firm understanding of what it is our movement is, first of all, and what it is that we are addressing in our movement. The key theme behind all of this is understanding what it means to be radical feminist. And I won't go through the recap of where we started, but I'll recap some of the things that we discussed last week, only because I feel that they are necessary building blocks to what we're going to go in this week. So I had asked if we could get different readers through last week's discussion. In reading an article that was shared by Emma on the UK Fellowship Group discussing, I'll say, the bad rep that radical feminism gets and the necessity of approaching feminist issues through the lens of radical feminism, and just how much you can achieve when you do so, and how much has been achieved, especially through the second wave of feminism, through dealing with them at a radical approach. And in that article, there was a specific section dealing with TERFs. And so if you recall, TERFs are trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And the reason why the author went through that process of understanding who TERFs are, what their core concerns are, and etc., is because typically, externally in society, if you were to mention the term radical feminist, it quickly gets associated with being trans exclusive. And so the author is trying to fight against this notion. And she emphasizes that the two don't go hand in hand, and they can't. Once you understand what it means to be radical and what it means to be a feminist, then by those definitions, you can't be trans exclusive. We defined a few terms. as we were going through it, we realized, hold on, there's a few terms that need defining to help us understand exactly what it means to be trans, what it means to be what gender is, what sex is. We won't go through those definitions. We might revisit some of them as we develop our study and carry on going through the study. So often, as I said in the introductory thoughts, these two approaches to dealing with feminist issues are pitted against each other. You're either fighting for trans rights or you're a radical feminist. But as we considered it, the author answers why radical feminism is connected to trans rights. And so people gave their opinions, gave their perspectives of why trans rights are feminist rights, why the fight is the same, why they are not synonymous, but it's the same fight. And so I just wanted to ask if there's anyone there that remembers some of those key ideas that we brought up as to why trans rights and the fight for equality amongst the sexes are rooted in the same ideas. So feel free to put up your hand or just speak up if you have any thoughts. It was shared last week, so this is more just trying to get the cogs turning. Natalie?
I'll speak if no one else. Trans rights are human rights, and trans women are women. It's like the
Okay,
one who exclude trans women are basically saying they're not real women, which is not the case.
sure. So you've given us a conclusion. You've given us the conclusion that trans women are women. You've given us the conclusion that trans rights are human rights, which is fair, but I was asking for the steps in which we get to that. How can we be sure that those two statements that you've given are true? Magda?
I wasn't here last week, but my answer to that would be that transgender people do experience sexism and discrimination against them as well. So they do recognizing the systematic problem and the discrimination as yeah.
Okay, so we recognize that in society, there's a systemic problem with regards to how we view the roles that each of us play in life and the categories that we're put into and the expectations that we have or that society has on us based on those categories. And so, as Magda has said, trans women or trans men are assigned this category when they're born, and they're expected to fulfill the roles of said category through their lives. But they realize that, hold on, there's something amiss. How I identify inside, how I see myself doesn't align with these expectations that society has for me. So if that is the fight for trans rights, where it stems from, that trans men need access to the medical facilities that born women have access to. Their fight for those rights is rooted in this same underbelly, if I can call it that. And when we think about what feminism is, it's this fight for equality of the sexes because of the recognition that patriarchy has put women and has put men in these predefined categories. You see that there's this overlap. It's the exact same fight. And so you can come to that conclusion that as that Natalie was making, that the rights that trans men and women are fighting for are human rights. They're universal. They share those rights that every human should have. And just because they go against that patriarchal model doesn't mean that they are any less deserving of said human rights. So a point of I don't want to say contention, but a point of no interest that the author points out is that when these discussions take place, often it's easy to overlook this foundational issue. And so she points our eyes or our direction to why egalitarian models are so difficult to achieve in the first place. So what do we mean by egalitarian models? If we think of what egalitarian means, does anyone have a working definition of what egalitarian means to help us? I guess I'll go if no one has definition, but it goes back to the principle that, yeah, someone wanted to say something. Natalie?
What I was gonna say, I think it's just it's a meaning that everybody has this, everyone deserves the rights, don't they?
Mhm.
I'm probably not articulating that properly, but it's just the principle of rights and opportunities for all, isn't it?
Exactly. So it's going back to what you pointed out, that human rights are universal, that trans individuals deserve these rights. And so if we have a model in society, a way in which society operates, that's what a model is, at a simplistic level, it's based on this principle that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities, with the caveat of understanding what that equality is. And so if we were to shift our focus into understanding why these egalitarian models are so hard to achieve, we have to get to the root of the problem of what makes it difficult. So does anyone have any ideas of what makes it so difficult to achieve these egalitarian models? We can look to various societies or various communities and where parts of this egalitarian model have been achieved, but in large, in its entirety, society hasn't reached that place. Why? Why is that the case?
I think Richard I was going to say patriarchy.
Yeah, me too.
What about patriarchy makes it so difficult to achieve these egalitarian models? To you, Debbie.
People want to hold on to, the men want to hold on to their power, don't they? They don't want to let it go.
Yeah. So this patriarchal model has fixed within men and women systems of belief of where they belong in society. And particularly, as you've expressed, men have an idea of where they sit in this hierarchy. And so, as with anything in life, it's difficult to let go of this belief that's instilled in you. Cedri, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I that's exactly what I want to say, because it's so instilled in us from like when we were born, and even before that, it's generations and generations of it. So it's hard to, not that it's not difficult to undo, but it does take very conscious effort to undo that. And it's just a very, very small percentage of people in this world that are very conscious of patriarchy, and the downside of it.
Sure. I think that goes along with the concept of that's what radical feminism aims to do. It aims to get to the root cause of the problem, of why this problem that exists, and getting to that root cause requires effort. If you were to think of a tree, and if you were to think of getting rid of that tree in the forest, it would be easier to cut down the branches, but to dig and uproot those roots, we recognize that you'd get rid of that bad tree, but it requires you digging and getting to its roots. Charity or Blessing, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's Charity.
Mhm.
So I was just thinking also that when you look at patriarchy, it's it's a system that's built upon dominance. So the system is inherently built upon this idea of one group of people being dominant over another. So once you have a system that is like that, then you cannot have any egalitarian principles thriving, let alone even being introduced in that. Yeah.
There's two models that exist in society. I'm going to put them against each other and show how they're the same in reinforcing what Charity said, is that we have the church model where we're directed and shaped by God, and then you have the model that stands antithesis to church, which is your evolutionary model. So if we can categorize that as your atheist. And in both instances, you have something that's preordained that imposes this dominant structure on society. On your one hand, in your church, you have God blessing, ordaining, and saying that this is how society should be ordered. And so this is how society will maintain peace if you keep it within this status-based hierarchy. No, that's not the case, but that's the justification that's given for this hierarchy. The divine right to rule, to have this dominance. And on the other hand, you have natural selection and evolution predetermining this hierarchy that exists. And so these two thoughts lead you to the same conclusion. These two lines of thinking lead you to the same conclusion, wherever you sit, whether you're in the world or whether you're in the church, both based upon, I'll say, wrong interpretations of both models, however you want to look at them. The author then came to arguments that TERFs make with regard to the threat that trans people have to the feminist movement. And there were two primary threats that TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, identify with trans people, and why it's necessary to exclude them from feminist movements. Does anyone recall what those two threats were? It's where we ended last week. We discussed them and then we didn't read the counter argument, but Natalie.
Was one of them to do with childbirth or not real women or something?
Sure. So
It's
one of them
done.
was to do with women's experiences. And so in second wave feminism, there was a large body of thought that saw women as a class of society. And that class, remember, this is driven by radical feminists, see that this class or this caste in society is oppressed because of political issues, political reasons. And so they needed ways in which to identify this class of women, or this class, or this portion, or this segment of society in that history. And one of the organizing principles came down to reproduction. And it's a legacy that's carried on through the years. And so what Natalie's pointed out is that cisgender women feel and believe that a woman is a woman because she can give birth. And in addition to that, is that she has lived experiences that trans women do not. And so it's important to organize women or connect people who are assigned female at birth around issues like reproduction, pregnancy, abortion, menstruation, menopause, things that assigned female at birth women experience. alongside that are the everyday experiences of sexism. We'll get more into that just now, but I see a hand. Charity or Blessing?
Oh, I just wanted to give the other reason or the other issue that was a threat.
Threat.
Yeah, the issue that those assigned male at birth were socialized and affected by male privilege. And therefore, that would definitely affect the way that trans women in this case would interact with those that were assigned female at birth, and would therefore endanger, those that were assigned female at birth.
Mm-hmm. So there's a belief that people assigned male at birth pose a physical threat to women assigned female at birth. It's hard to keep all these concepts in mind at the same time. So if I slip up, please bear with me. But yes, as Blessing recognized or recalled, that there's this fear of violence against women assigned female at birth. And so they feel that there's a necessity to keep spaces for women only. In their eyes, true women need these spaces. It's this idea, as has been articulated, that when a person is born and they experience the world, they're socialized in a certain way, despite their inherent nature. And so you're socialized as a man in this world, and despite you being a trans woman, you being socialized as that man puts you in a position that gives you privilege in society, as well as I don't know if I'm expressing this correctly, but gives you the proclivity to be violent towards women because of the socialization. So there's this fear of violence from trans women. So those were the two threats that they feel. And then after that, in the second paragraph, the author offers counter arguments, and that's where we ended. We didn't get into those, but if anyone read those counter arguments, could you give me the first counter argument to the first issue, fear of violence? Before we do that, I want us to think about this one and what your beliefs are about humans, about men and about women. So, Debbie, are women born nice people? Are women born nurturing and caring?
This is what it's been said in society.
Mm-hmm.
This is what they've said in society. I don't know how they can come up with that.
Sure. So you would
But
say
I mean,
no.
they're saying it to fit in with their system, basically.
Mm-hmm. And the reality is, why do we see so many women as being nurturing and caring?
Because that's how they want. Well, I think men can be like that as well.
I'm not asking about men.
Yeah,
I'm asking about
saying,
women.
well, it's society that's saying that women are this way because that's how men understand them to be, and that's the part of the patriarchal society to keep them that way.
Mm-hmm.
Men are manly. I know you want to talk about men are manly and strong, and women are nurturing. This soft, subdued sort of thing because it fits in with the patriarchal system, which is what they want to portray women.
If I were to look in society and I were to look at all the families that are around me, I'll tell you that the majority of women that I do see are nurturing. They are the if I can say outliers of that normal distribution that aren't nurturing, that aren't caring. But from what I see, most women are. Why is that? Are they inherently that way? What's the reason? That's what I'm asking. Well, I don't know if you agree or not.
Well, you could say that because we have mothers, but I don't know if you can bring that into it either. So why are we that way?
I saw a hand.
Yes, I don't know how to answer that one. Sorry.
Sure, that's fine. Magda?
Yeah, so we do born same. So it is not given by nature, but
Mm.
it is given by the way we are raised. So girls are prompted to be nurturing and caring, and playing with certain things like dolls and that stuff. And the same as with men, like there is the way we are basically raised, what we are playing with, what we are prompted to do and don't do. So it is given by the culture and society, and we are raised that way. But we do born same way, so it is not given by nature, but nurture.
Yeah. So there's this argument of whether our characteristics, whether our beings are in our nature, they're inherent to us, or we're nurtured in that way. So I've asked you about women, and you recognize that. So what about men? If we just take the opposite of those characteristics that I gave, that men are aggressive, that men are violent, that men are not nurturing. I don't know what the opposite of nurturing would be. If I were to look in society, the majority of men are that way. And so back to you, Magda, you would say the reason that they are that way is not because they're born like that, but because of the different elements in society that socializes that way. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
So those are your assigned male at birth. So going back to that first argument that was raised by Blessing, this fear that people who have been socialized in a certain way, they would say, okay, not all trans women will behave like this, but in the same way, not all men will behave like this, assigned male at birth will behave that way. What gaps do you see in that argument to anyone? That this person who was assigned male at birth goes about their life being socialized as a man, and as we recognize what it means to be socialized as a man in general, would lead you to certain proclivities. I don't know if that's the right word. Why is that a reasonable argument, first and foremost? And if it isn't, why isn't it a reasonable argument against this fear of trans women? Remember, a trans woman is someone who has assigned male at birth, who grows up, or at whatever stage in their life, they recognize that, hold on, I'm not like this. And so sometimes they transition, sometimes they don't. I don't know if my question makes sense. Cedri, you want to say something, and then I'll go to you, Magda.
Yeah, I think they are, because it's sorry, what was your question again?
I was just asking whether that fear from trans exclusionary individuals is a reasonable fear based on what we've said about how different people come up in society, how these two different groups experience society, and how society experiences them or places experiences on them.
Yeah, I think there is a reasonable what was the next word?
Argument.
Argument, because there's so many cases of men being really aggressive, men raping women, men being violent, lots more men in the prisons than there are women for their violence. And yeah, so I think there is.
So Cedri sees that it makes sense why they would be trans exclusionary. Not saying that Cedri is trans exclusionary, but she sees some logic to it in the way that I've articulated the argument, at least. Does anyone else have any other thoughts? I think Magda wanted to say something before Cedri jumped in. If not, then yeah, Magda.
Yeah, so I think that a lot, I'm not saying everything, but a lot with transgender people is driven by the culture and the expectations. I believe there's maybe something inherent in them, or I'm not sure. I don't understand basically the topic completely, but I think it is driven a lot by culture and expectations. And I think they usually do not fit in these boxes of what society expecting of them. So if they do get born as a male, with sex organs males and or women, sex organs women, so there is already expectation of them to be boxed in, behave certain way and do things certain way if they are male or female. And so I believe they do not feel like they fit this. So that's why they probably become transgender people. There can be something behind this more. Like I think like we don't understand properly yet the topic. So I believe that they already do have a problem with the way maybe they are raised. I'm not sure. But
Sure.
yeah, that's my thoughts.
Sure. I'll offer an opposing thought. Well, not an opposing thought, just something to think about. That I'll give the example of me. I'm born, I am assigned male at birth based on my organs, and there's nothing in me that says I don't resonate with what a society expects on me. So, according to your argument, there is something within me that resonates with these expectations of being strong and tough and aggressive and subsequently being violent towards women. So I'm just doing the contrast of what you said, Magda. And I'm sure, I don't know if we recognize that, if that is the case for people who aren't trans and why they end up violent. Natalie?
Kind of forgot the question now, but I was just thinking, sounds like everybody thinks that, not everybody, a few people think that trans exclusionary feminists believe in nature, not nurture. And I think that when you get to the roots of it, why are trans exclusionary fearing the trans women? For me, it's rooted in sexism, even though they're women, the radical feminists who are exclusionary, because of women. Some women we see in society, even though they're feminists, they support patriarchy. They speak like patriarchal and sexist. So probably not anything to do with what you're really asking, but to get that off my chest.
Sure. I guess as you said, that's not always the case, though. They are feminists who recognize the issues of sexism, but they have this fear. Charity, Blessing?
Okay, I don't know if I'll be able to answer your question, but I've got this thought that to me it sounds like with the TERFs, they are also buying into the the stereotypes that are there in society, and they're buying into these stereotypes where they're basically how can I say this? Putting women and men in boxes, right? And then as they're putting those boxes, then they say women are like this and men are like that. Like, for example, women are nurturing. Wait, which one is it? Nurturing, yes. Nurturing and caring, and they wouldn't hurt a fly, right? And then men, on the other hand, they're aggressive, they're violent, they're this. So if this person, or this person was assigned male at birth transitions, they are really just going to transition outwardly, but really they still have the same characteristics, if I can say, that a man has. So therefore, they're also going to be, they'll continually be violent, because anyway, they are a man, right? So basically, to them, they're still a man, and they're going to be violent. They're not going to treat other women, you know, right. They're not going to be nurturing and caring and loving as a woman would be. That's what I thought in my mind.
So there's two thoughts, and I've steered away from one because it's not really what I was addressing, which is there's this notion of gender essentialism, which is that you're born with a set characteristics based on your gender. And there are self-proclaimed radical feminists who believe this, that women are women because they're born as women, and you can't change that in your life. And then so that's one model in which you view people, and you can look at that model, and it's just plain sexism, as you've pointed out, Charity. There's another model that recognizes that our characteristics are socialized. And it's this one that I was addressing, that when you get TERFs who come and see people who are assigned male at birth have been socialized into a certain way, violence, etc., all your stereotypical masculine traits, it's that stream that I was pinpointing and digging at. And then I wanted to talk about just off the back of that, this idea of stereotypes. And we recognize the dangers of stereotypes, but I wanted to bring up the, I'll say, necessity of stereotypes. Imagine a world where women, as it exists, imagine if women walking the street at night didn't have a guard up in their minds of the stereotype that fits how men behave, and they just treated them like a blank slate. I'm sure we recognize that that would put them in a dangerous position. And so they have to treat all men as if they are probable of enacting of violence for their protection. So I've spoken about the dangers of stereotypes, and this, imagine if people didn't have those guards up based on stereotypes that we see in society. Emma?
Yes, I don't know if you just said that really, but what I was going to say about nature and nurture, I was going to just say that I don't know if TERFs are actually worried about nature, but because nurture is strong enough to actually, it was kind of what you were just saying, that was I think that's what you were saying. You were going to focus on that group that say it's all about how they've been raised, because from day one they're nurtured in a certain way, that men are nurtured this way and women are nurtured that way, and that's actually really strong, and it does make men into that stereotype, as you've said, and women into the other stereotype, because we're forced into that box. And as Magda said, they're stepping out of the box. Trans people often saying, I don't fit in that box, I don't want to be in this box. So they're stepping out against the way they've been nurtured, I think. And I hear you about stereotypes. I think that's important to recognize, but at the same time, stereotypes have to be tested and proved. And so with the TERFs, there's no evidence with trans people, there's no evidence that trans women attack other women. In fact, it's the contrary. Trans people themselves get more attacks than women ever have by trans people. I think that's what the article said from memory. But yeah.
And so we
So-
get to yeah, sorry, I never let you finish.
No, that's fine. I did finish. I was just gonna, repeat myself. Go on, carry on.
Okay. And so we get to those counter arguments. I'll come to you, Natalie, where the author points out that there's no data that supports this claim that trans women pose any notable physical threat or danger to cisgender women. My question was why? Why don't they pose this notable threat or danger to cis women? What causes them in early childhood to push back against these stereotypes that are imposed on people assigned male at birth and vice versa, assigned female at birth? What is it about that I, assigned male at birth, who isn't trans, would claim to, would be drawn to? And I'm talking about what we would consider negative traits. There's no such thing as negative traits, but the ones that lead to negative outcomes, like violence against women, in this context, at least. And so, as Emma pointed out, in fact, what studies have shown is that trans women are 4 times as likely as cisgender women to experience violent victimization, because society has these expectations on how they are, how they behave, how they look, and so they go through violence for different reasons. Natalie, you wanted to say something?
Would we say that trans exclusionary feminists are not mainstream feminists?
Elaborate on that.
Only because I know of a word called misandrist, which is a
Miss,
form, misandrist, MISTSANDIRST, I think. Look it up. And they are obviously they're men haters, of course, but they are a bit sexist, and I was just wondering if they would come under that category. They mistrust men, they dislike. So, what's the root of these trans exclusionary feminists who don't like the trans women? So I was just mentioning that word because I was wondering if they're not mainstream feminists, like the trans inclusively feminists like we are, then they might come under that.
I'll have to think about that. I've never come across that word. So if you're pointing out this group of proclaimed feminists that hate men, is that
I didn't
what
say
you're
they claim they're feminists, but they are. Then they're basically when you look up that word, it says that mainstream feminism is not linked to that. Mainstream feminists are not misandrists. They seek equal rights, obviously, for men and women. So because it was connected to the word feminism, I looked it up and I thought, what is this word, misandrist? And it's especially women who hate or dislike or mistrust men. So because of this mistrust with trans exclusionary radical feminists, I was just wondering if it had something to do with who they are, really, what the root cause is.
It could be. I've my first time coming across the term. I know the concept of it being the counterpart of misogyny. Essentially, we could go into the reasons why that arises, this misandry. But whether it's related to being trans exclusive, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer for you. Sorry.
Do you have an answer? Are we calling trans exclusionary radical feminists mainstream feminists?
Does
No.
anyone have a thought on that? Charity?
Sorry, you said what? Are we
Would you-
calling TERFs mainstream feminists?
Yeah.
No, because I think TERFs, it means they're trans exclusionary radical feminists. So I don't think they would be mainstream feminists.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that's what we call them. I was saying, would we say that they're definitely not mainstream feminists? Because, and you're right, Charity, because their exclusion of trans women, they're definitely not mainstream. But I just wanted to put that out there so we could see the difference. They're not mainstream feminists like ourselves.
We're not mainstream feminists as well.
Well, I
Yeah,
mean, like,
yeah,
we're radical feminists, yeah.
yeah. And if we just go back to our definitions of what it means to be mainstream/liberal feminist, it's this fight for equal rights by integrating those that have been marginalized and excluded into the system, which they don't do. Okay, and so the second counter argument to women's experiences, I read something interesting in a book. It's called, the book is called, let me find what the book's called. But I'm going to post the passage in the chat, and if I could just get someone to read it, that would be great. Oh, the book is called Fix the System, Not the Women. And in, I don't know where the chat is. Yeah. So in answer to this idea that women assigned female at birth have different experiences of sexism in life, and have different experiences of what it means to be women that trans women don't have, this points to the fact that trans women can't be real women. But we recognize that women have different experiences in life. And this paragraph is a counter argument to this exclusion of trans women. If I could get someone to read that. Can I ask you to read it, Sidri?
Yeah, okay. Where do I start? But this is
From the
ludicrous.
top. Yeah. So what she's pointing out is ludicrous is being trans exclusionary on the basis of lived experiences of sexism and etc.
But this is ludicrous, partly because no two women's experiences can ever be identical. Many will have been bolstered by forms of protected privilege by nature of their class, race, or sheer good fortune, which means they themselves can never truly understand and have not experienced the same forms of oppression as other women. We do not exclude those women from our movement. We do not demand that everybody prove they have experienced identical histories of oppression in order to be included, except, suddenly, when it comes to trans women. But, perhaps more importantly, it is short-sighted not to recognize that a trans woman has her own list. And while some of the individual incidents on it may look a bit different, for example, ridicule for transgressively displaying markers of femininity while inhabiting a body designated male at birth, or suffocation in the heavily stereotyped environment of locker room banter that invalidates and undermines their very existence, it is nonetheless a list of misery and oppression forged by the very same restrictions that affect us all. Yes, it might manifest a little differently, but don't all our histories? To argue that trans youth are deeply injured by gendered stereotypes, binaries, and pressures is surely facetious.
Sure. So this is specifically in the context of trans women. And what she's pointing out is that different women have different experiences of sexism in their lives. And those experiences will look different based on where you are in society. If you are rich versus if you're poor, if you have a certain race versus another. And so different women have all different experiences of sexism. But just because one woman can never truly understand that experience of sexism that another woman has, doesn't mean that we exclude those women from the fight for women's rights. And so in the same breath, trans women have their own experiences of sexism. And so in that breath, we see that it becomes a necessity to recognize their fight against the system as a whole. And the same could be said for trans men. So women, people who are assigned female at birth, who transition and are trans men. They have their experiences of sexism and expectations that they face in life, amongst which is the sexual violence that they experience once they do transition. In the discussions that we have around this issue or this topic, there's two approaches in which we can have it. There's what the author notes as political dog whistling, which happens in broader politics and media culture around trans rights. So if we were to think of Donald Trump or the Republican Party, or yeah, in England, Rishi Sunak and the Tory Conservative Party. The issues related to trans rights are often dog whistles. So they'll point to something, but it's coded in coded language to reinforce this gendered or patriarchal society. Dog whistling, if you were to think of what a dog whistle is, it's so loud that only a dog can hear it, but humans can't hear it. And so when the author refers to political dog whistling, it's when political actors say things in coded language, not explicitly, but in a way that those who are listening and those that resonate with said political message are able to hear it and are able to act on what they've heard. And so a lot of the arguments that happen in political speech is not really trying to identify the issues, the pros, the cons with the fight for trans rights from an objective perspective. It's coming from being political and tribal. It's coming from that approach based on their perceptions of social order and etc. And then the second approach is the political clashes that happen within feminism. And as the author points out, and I feel necessary to point out, is that we need to be able to contrast and distinguish between these two streams if we're going to learn anything from these discussions. And so that means that when we do discuss these issues, we need to recognize that there'll be nuances. And so we can have less reactionary discussions about what it means to be a trans woman, what it means to be a trans man, whether trans women should be allowed in women's only spaces, just as the question I posed earlier is that argument really valid or is it not? We should be able to see the nuances in those arguments without being distracted by the political dog whistles. And in closing, the author points out that accusations of being a TERF have often been used as a tool for outright dismissal of people, text, ideas, body of thought, and even historical periods of feminism, which can creep into our discussions. So if, just for instance, someone, when I asked, does that argument from TERFs sound valid? And someone were to stand up and say, yeah, no, that makes sense to me, that men are socialized in a certain way. So why would that change when someone transitions? Why would their psyche, their character just change? So is there no threat to violence? Often when ideas like that are raised or thoughts like that are raised, the term "you are a TERF" is used as a silencing weapon, if we can call it that. What we didn't discuss is the integration of trans women into female sports or assigned female at birth sports.
Curtis.
And yeah, yep, I lost my thought. Carry on.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, the reason why I ended up saying something is because I'd been raising my hand for a long time.
Okay. Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I'd wanted to comment on something you had said a long time ago, actually.
Oh,
So I then
whoops.
realized, okay, Curtis keeps going, so I don't know what to do. So sorry
Carry
about
on. No, that's fine.
that. The issue of excluding trans people made me think about something.
Mhm.
And that is, it seems to me, it seems to suggest that you can only be a radical feminist if you're a woman, according to a specific definition. Why I say that is because the argument that, we exclude trans people because, or particularly in this case, trans women, because they are a threat due to their socialization as males growing up. It seems to suggest that in order for you basically your right of entry into the feminist movement or the radical feminist movement is having suffered as a woman, having been a victim. And what that does is it excludes half of the population, meaning most of the men, let me not say no man, but most of the men that live in this world could never be radical feminists because most of the men in this world, including those that do become radical feminists, have not come close to any sort of victimization that women have gone through because of patriarchy and sexism, right? And I don't agree with that, of course, but it really made me think about how that argument doesn't make sense. Because it's not just about experiencing the victimization. It's about being able to identify it and oppose it. Because if a man who has been socialized as a man can come to a point where they recognize that there is injustice being done and we need to turn against this system, then that socialization argument becomes null and void, if you get what I'm saying. Because to hold on to that argument would necessitate that radical feminism be a movement that is limited only to women. And when I say women, I mean those assigned female at birth. And that would just create another problem. It would essentially perpetuate the discrimination that feminism is meant to destroy or eradicate, promoted by patriarchy, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I get your argument with regards to the inclusive nature of radical feminism in ideology, in political action. How does that translate to the fears of permitting trans women into women-only spaces? So a women's only gym.
But here's the thing, Kurt. I don't think that they were not just talking about women's only spaces, because
Yep.
because
I
when
agree.
they say they're excluding trans, they're saying, you can't have trans as part of our fight.
Mhm.
Trans women cannot be part of our fight. So it wasn't only about having them in the said women-only spaces. It was actually having them part of the movement, which is why I'm saying that argument does not make sense. So even if they say they felt threatened, of course, we've discussed the issue of data and that actually trans women have more, like they're more likely to be victimized than
Yep.
cisgender women. So I guess I'm approaching it from a point where that argument has already been given. So I'm not even answering that question. If
Okay.
anything, I'm just saying the whole issue of actually saying trans people cannot be part of our movement. In this case, it's trans women, because we are afraid of, how they would treat other women, that fear should go across the board. It should then apply to men, because men are socialized in a certain way. And if a man becomes a radical feminist, yes, there's ideology, but a movement normally organizes and they work together. They do things together. We might not use the same bathroom, for argument's sake, in a public space. I'm not getting into all the nitty-gritties of that, but we'll meet, you know, whether it's for conferences, for whatever activities that we're going to do. The men and women that claim to be radical feminists will be in the same space. So if the fear is going to be applied to the trans women, it might as well be applied to the men, the cisgender men. Yeah. So that's why I was saying I don't think it actually works, because if they hold on to, if they take it to its logical conclusion, then radical feminism must be a movement that's only for cisgender women. That's what I was saying. And once it becomes that, it perpetuates the discrimination of the patriarchy. That's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, I hear you. And I agree. Emma, you have your hand up.
Just on the back of Blessing's point, I was thinking the same thing for point number 2 there, that if we're going to say that trans women can't be part of the movement, radical feminists, because their experience is different in their manifestation of sexism because they're raised as male, I was going to say, where does that leave the LGBT community in the sense of lesbians and gays? Because lesbians have a very different lived experience as a woman than I know I'm going to go crossover with the gender and sex now, but if you understand what I mean, sexuality is treated very differently from a heterosexual woman, and the same with homosexual men are treated very differently from heterosexual men, because that's a huge box in society as well, that you're not allowed to be a lesbian or a gay. So if you're going to start saying your lived experience is very different from a cisgender woman, you're going to end up, as Blessing is kind of alluding to, that a radical feminist movement will just be made up of cisgender white women, I guess, or women that have had the same lived experience in whatever way, and that's going to be very narrow, and actually starts excluding lots of people.
And that's where the paragraph that Cedri read comes in, is pointing out that just because if you recognize that amongst even cisgender women, there's all these varied experiences of sexism, you wouldn't exclude a certain category of women based on them not experiencing it because of whatever privilege society affords them. For example, a rich woman. So that extrapolates to all the different examples that come up. A lesbian woman doesn't have that experience that I'll say the general population of women experience, but you wouldn't exclude them from this fight for equal rights. And then that extends to trans women as well. Charity?
Yeah, okay. So I was just thinking as well that when you look at the fight, the feminist fight, especially the radical feminist fight, you notice that even when we spoke in the other presentations that you did, the earlier presentations, you basically spoke about how the feminist movement also, when it came up at a time where they basically sort of drew their light from the civil rights movement, right? And when you look at the civil rights movement, the fight was basically a fight for basically the inequalities in society. Well, in this case, it's with race, right? And then it's recognizing how the inequalities that are in society needs to be dealt with. And there has to be created a platform where all people are seen as equal, right? And meaning basically that there's people that are being oppressed in society, right? And if that is the core foundation of the movement, they have to recognize the different groups of people that are in society and how they are being oppressed, and they don't have the same rights as other people do. So once you do not recognize the struggle that trans women or trans men are having within society or, you know, the LGBTQ community. It invalidates, like the quote say, it invalidates someone's experience, and it basically ignores or sidelines those people and basically says, okay, you're not really being oppressed. You're not really going through any inequality in society if you don't menstruate, if you don't, you know, go through this and that. That's just gender women go through. And I think it's important also to go back to that foundation of why people in society had to get up and actually fight these systems, because it's coming from that place where you're recognizing the oppression that is there in society of these different groups. And in this case, for the feminists, it's basically focusing on women's rights, but you can't then make of no effect the experiences of other different groups.
Yeah. And so just from what you've said, you can see how incompatible it is to be trans-exclusionary and a radical feminist, because the whole premise of radical feminism is seeing that this oppression, will stick to women, that women face is coming from a root cause. And once you understand what that root cause is, as a radical feminist would, you can see how it affects lesbians, you can see how it affects gay men, you can see how it affects men, you can see how it affects trans women, and the list goes on. So it's just going back to the initial point of the incompatibility of being trans exclusionary as well as a radical feminist. So just wrapping up this theme of TERFs, what I had noted before was how the symbol or the label TERF is used as an outright dismissal of people, texts, ideas, bodies of thought, and discussion in general. And when that happens, we fail to then identify who or what ideas, what concepts are being excluded. And worse off, in my mind, we fail to understand what kind of inclusivity matters. And these questions are often left unexamined, as the author points out. And it's the last sentence that will lead us into our second half of our study. We need to think about how we move towards a radical reimagining of sex and gender itself. And that's what a radical feminist does. They reimagine, they take a system and they reimagine it, because they recognize that this system inherently causes inequality. So we've spent quite a big chunk of time Two seconds, sorry.
Wait, sorry, Curtis.
Okay, there for you, Natalie. We've spent quite a bit of time going through why we are not TERFs, TERFs, why we're not trans-exclusionary. And I think we can see why. We can see the arguments against being trans-exclusionary. And so now the inverse of that is what it means to be trans-inclusive radical feminists and what the implications of that are, so we can understand, as the author put it, what kind of inclusivity matters. What does inclusion mean? What does it mean to look at this subject from a radical feminist lens? And this is where we'll go back to some of the definitions that we started off with. And sex, as we defined it in the studies last week, were referred to the physical characteristics in a simple level, the physical characteristics that a person has at their birth, with regards to their chromosomes, with regards to their genetics, and etc. That's what sex is. The second term is identity. When you think of identity, what comes to mind? How would you define identity, a person's identity? We haven't defined that previously, but
Could
how
it
would
be?
you understand it?
Could it be how they identify themselves?
Okay, you can't use a word to define itself, because
I
you're saying
mean, so if
identity
you,
is identity.
oh right, so I mean, how do you? I mean, if you're going to ask a person if they're male or female, that's what I'm looking at.
Not going into male and female, just
Oh, you're not.
identity
Oh, you mean just
at a high level.
identity?
Mhm.
How do you identify yourself, or how do you? Oh, I don't know. I know what I meant to say, but I don't know how to get it
Yeah.
out.
That's okay. So just at a broad level, an umbrella term, we're to think of my identity as Curtis, or your identity as Debbie, or your identity as Charity, with her hand up.
Okay, I'm just thinking of when you speak about identity, it's about how you see yourself, or how you I don't know, experience yourself. I don't know if it's experiencing, but yeah, basically how you see yourself, how you feel, who you are. Yeah, because
Okay.
I think with identity, it goes deeper than just your sexuality.
Mhm.
Right? It's all about you, who you are, how you I'm failing to find the right words, but yeah, I hope you get it.
Sure. I do get you. That it's this idea of how you see yourself and who you are. I'm going to ask a follow-up question. What does it mean to be who you are? What are the different components that make up you? So if I were to ask you, Charity, who is Charity? Tell me about yourself.
Oh.
You don't
That's a
have to
hard
answer that
one.
about yourself, but just think of anyone in
Yeah.
general.
Okay, it's more to do with the things that you're comfortable with yourself, like feeling comfortable in, I don't know if it's your own skin, or with a certain way of seeing yourself. Well, my words are failing me, but I have it in mind. I can't get it out.
That's okay. It is a difficult thing to define because it's so broad, if I want to say it that way.
Can I say something, sir?
Yeah,
You know,
I think Sidri wanted to say something
sorry,
first,
I beg
and
your
then
pardon.
I'll go to you. Yeah, Sidri.
Like where you come from. When people always say, I mean, I always talk about where I come from. Our beautiful community in Zimbabwe at that time, Acadia. How we were brought up, the church played a very important part. Who you are now, what you're doing now, and
Okay.
Your goals and aspirations.
Sure. Goals, aspirations. So you've given us
Purpose.
yeah, etc., etc. So you've given us things that I think will fit into the concept that I'm trying to draw out. And once I give my list, you'll all say, yeah, that's what I meant. So when we think of identity, we recognize and we see it as this multifaceted concept, a concept that has different aspects to it. And these encompass different things that range from your characteristics. So if you were to think Charity, if I were to ask you, who is Charity? I would think you would tell me, oh, these are the characteristics that I have. So your characteristics, your beliefs, as has been put in the chat, people have pointed out that they're radical feminists. So Natalie, I were to ask you, who is Natalie? You tell me, I'm a radical feminist. I'm an Adventist. I'm waiting for the advent of Christ. You're telling me about your beliefs, about your church, as Cedric pointed out. And it also encompasses your expressions. So how do you express yourself? How do you express those characteristics? How do you express those beliefs to the outside world? And then affiliations as well. So who are you affiliated to? I would say, who's Curtis? Oh, I'm the child of my Margaret and Brian. Courtney is my brother. Or affiliations to organizations as a whole. I'm affiliated to this movement. I'm affiliated to Sky. I'm affiliated to different affiliations that you have in life. So there's not one thing that defines you. We recognize that there's multiple things that you could say, this makes up my identity. If I wanted to explain who Magda was to Blessing, Blessing's never met Magda, I'll say XYZ is Magda. Magda likes going outdoors. Magda likes dogs. Magda is part of the movement. She likes going on adventures. That composes who Magda is. And so you get an understanding, an insight into Magda's identity. So there's personal identity, which is what I think we've all pointed to, is this innermost sense of self, which is shaped by your your lived experiences, history, and the different choices that you make. Then there's your cultural identity. If we were to think of, as Cedric pointed out, she resonates or identifies with a certain culture that she's grown up in Zimbabwe, growing up in a certain neighborhood and the different things that fit into that culture. That's how she identifies outside of her personal self. And then there's your social identity. How does the world see you? And there's a lot of critiques that we could give of that social identity, of how the world sees you because of the expectations that they have on you. But these are the different elements of your identity. And I'm sure we can all recognize that your identity, my identity for certain, isn't static. It evolves as time grows. As I learn new things, as I'm exposed to different things, as I experience different people, different cultures, different customs, I have different experiences. And so these changes in my personal circumstances or in people's personal circumstances or their social environments or social context or cultural context influence how people perceive themselves and their identity. So that's what we would understand as identity. So the third term that I want us to uncover and discuss, and we'll read through about 6 different sources or 5 different sources of defining the same thing or the same term, just so that we can see that there's a general consensus. Charity, you've got your hand up, but I don't know if that was from before or it's
No,
your
that was
hand.
from before. Sorry.
Okay, that's not a problem. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. So that I can get 4 people to read. So this is from the World Health Organization. Can I get 4 different people to read? Charity, can you be the first one? Just because your name is right in front of me. Charity? Okay. Someone else?
Hi, sorry, Curtis, I can't.
That's okay. That's fine. Emma, can you read this first part?
Gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, man, girl, or boy, as well as relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. So
Okay.
carry on.
Yeah, no, you can just read that. So remember that, Emma. Remember how the World Health Organization understands gender, or this term gender. And then a second one, Magda, can you read here from Wikipedia on how Wikipedia defines gender?
Curtis.
Gender
Sorry,
includes
Magda.
I can't see hands if your hand is up, Lacey.
No, my hand wasn't up, actually.
Okay. Yep.
Sorry, Magda. I just wanted to ask her if you could
It's okay.
zoom in a bit.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, that's all I wanted. Thanks.
Okay. That's as far as I can go. Sorry.
Yeah, that's better.
Go on, Magda.
Gender includes the social, psychological, cultural, and behavioral aspects of being a man, woman, or other gender identity. Depending on the context, this may include sex-based social structures, example, gender roles, and gender expressions. Most cultures use a gender binary in which gender is divided in two categories and people are considered part of one or other, girls, women, and boys, men. Those who are outside these groups may fall under the umbrella terms non-binary. A number of societies have specific genders besides men and women, such as the Hijras. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Hijras? I'm not
I
sure.
don't know.
Okay, of South Asia. These are often referred to as third genders and fourth genders, etc. Most scholars agree that gender is a central characteristic for social organization.
You can stop there. And then the second paragraph just points to when in history society started distinguishing between gender and sex. Prior to this point, they were used as synonymous terms. I'll read this sentence just before we go on to the next one. In the West, in the 1970s, feminist theory embraced the concept of a distinction between biological sex and the social construct of gender. And then can I get another person? Debbie?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Is it just the first sentence?
Until I say stop.
Okay. Different terms are regularly used in theories of sexuality and gender. For example, sex, gender, gender identity, gender expressions, gender roles, sexual orientation. It is important to be clear about the meanings of such terms. Gender is an area that cuts across thinking about society, law, politics, and culture, and is frequently discussed in relation to other aspects of identity and social position, such as class, ethnicity, age, and physical ability. Gender is also an important concept within a range of social and political debates and may influence these debates differently according to culture context. Gender is a heavy
you
word.
can stop there.
Oh, sorry, beg your
pardon. If you read this little paragraph.
Okay, the World Health Organization summarizes the differences between sex and gender in the following way. Sex refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of males and females, such as reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormones, etc. Gender refers to the socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between groups of women and men. It varies from society to society and can be changed. The concept of gender includes 5 important elements: rational, relational, hierarchical, historical, contextual, and institutional. While most people believe people are born either male or female. They are taught appropriate norms and behaviours, including how they should interact with others of the same or opposite sex within households, communities, and workplaces. When individuals or groups do not fit established gender norms, they often face stigma, discriminatory practices, or social exclusion, all of which adversely affect health.
Thank you, Debbie. And then this article offers different definitions from different institutions about what gender is. And then the second last one, I'll read this one from Psychology Today. All humans are born with biological characteristics of sex, either male, female, or intersex. Gender, however, is a social construct and generally based on the norms, behaviors, and societal roles expected of individuals based primarily on their sex. I mean, gender identity describes a person's self-perceived gender, which could be male, female, or otherwise. And then finally, this last one. Who's there? Emma? Oh, wait, you read the first one. No. Susan, are you able to read?
Okay. Where am I reading from? This sex? both from?
Yeah, this whole bit.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
What is gender? What is sex? Sex and gender are often used interchangeably, despite having different meanings. Sex refers to a set of biological attributes in humans and animals. It is primarily associated with physical and sociological features, including chromosomes, genes, expressions, hormone levels and functions, and reproductive sexual autonomy. Sex is usually categorized as female or male, but there is variations in the biological attributes that comprise sex and how those attributes are expressed. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, and men, and gender diverse people. It influences how people perceive themselves and each other, how they act and interact, and the distribution of power and resources in society. Gender identity.
You can stop there, Susan. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And then finally, this condition on the NHS's website of gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a term that describes a sense of unease that a person may have because of a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity. This sense of unease or dissatisfaction may be so intense it can lead to depression and anxiety and have a harmful impact on daily life. Natalie, what was the common theme in all these different places of what gender is?
I wasn't really listening to all the reading. It was going way too fast for me, over my head. Sorry.
Oh.
Someone else?
Yeah, okay. Anyone else that picked up on the common theme of what gender is?
Gender is a social construct. So
You go, Blessing.
no, go ahead, Magda. Sorry.
No, you can go. It's okay.
Okay, I was just saying that gender is a social construct.
Magda, were you going to say the same thing or something different?
I wanted to say that's kind of like the inner being, inner sense of ourselves.
So that would be gender identity. Yeah, what you picked up on. So it's connected to gender identity. So this common theme in the definition of what gender is that it's a social construct. I want to ask the question. I'll give my perspective, and then If you disagree with what a social construct is, you can tell me. But if we were to look into society and it's self-descriptive, social in relation to society, people, institutions, and cultures and systems, and then construct in how something is put together, how something is categorized and boxed and identified. So putting those two concepts together, we recognize that there's this concept that these systems, these groups of people, that society have put together around certain terms, certain elements within that system that we live in. So that's what a social construct is. It's been put together by us. It's not fixed. It's not like we would look at the laws of physics or the laws of chemistry and say that that is predetermined, so to speak. There's demonstrable science behind it, if I can put it that way, where A equals B. Because gender is this social construct, a common theme that we read is that it varies from culture to culture. How one culture understands gender will be different to another culture because it's created by humans. And because humans go through different experiences, they understand things differently based on where they are environmentally, where they are in history, what challenges they face. But this common theme is that gender is this social construct. So if we were to go back to liberal feminism and what liberal feminism is, this reminder of what liberal feminism is that it works within the system by bringing women into that existing system. What does that system, the system that we have in society, look like with regards to the behaviors, stereotypes of sex and gender? That's a question for anyone to answer. What does that system look like? It's patriarchy, as Natalie said, and that patriarchy has, I said it in my prelude, has stereotypes or expectations of how men or women should behave, how these categories should exist in society. So if we were to think of bringing people who experience this disconnect between their behaviors and societal expectations into that already patriarchal system, have you solved the problem? Have you solved the problem that trans people face? Because their problem is that they have this issue with patriarchy. And so if you bring them into that system, that problem, as has been indicated in the chat, isn't going to be resolved. When we talk about the parable of the wheat and tares and we understand plants are within the field, what point are we emphasizing when we bring that point to the floor? When we talk about we're in the field and so we're part of the field, we're in the world, there can be different points, but what point is being emphasized by pointing out that we are in that field in the church? Okay, not
Say that
society.
again, Curtis. That answer there was about something else. Can you just quickly?
I was asking when we point out that we are plants in the field of this world, what effect does that have on us or the people that are in that field? What are the implications of that? What point is raised when we make that, use that parable, if I can say it that way?
I don't understand the question.
Can I try?
Yeah.
That there's a symbiotic relationship between the plant and the field. So there's a symbiotic relationship between us and society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so society is going to be your field, and that field is going to impact those plants. And if we recognize that all humanity is in this field, that's in this cycle, this symbiotic relationship, we can look at, in our context, in our story, trans individuals and see that they're also impacted by this field, by being in this society. And so what does trans inclusion look like within patriarchal structures? As we pointed out, the expectations that patriarchy has on gender and sex have their risks when we want to include trans individuals into that structure. What are those risks? Knowing that they're also impacted by the many things that the field has, the different weeds, the different thorns that are in that field. If we can say patriarchy, they're susceptible to those problems as well. What are the risks of not wheat and tears? What are the
Mouse?
oh, sorry. Okay, sure. What's the risk of integrating trans individuals into the system that's already patriarchal?
Very high risk.
Not the levels of the risk. What is the risk? We've spoken about the fact that the patriarchal system is sexist. It has stereotypes. We've spoken about the concept of gender. We've spoken about the fact that it's the socialized behavior, that there's stereotypes. So just bringing those together, what's the risk of bringing trans individuals into a system that's already sexist? Someone had unmuted and wanted to say something. They'll be discriminated and oppressed. Yes, that's correct. Susan?
Physically harmed.
Yes, they'll be
Emotionally
physically
harmed.
agreed. They'll be physically, emotionally harmed. But so
Does it
I guess my question is not what effect society will have on them, but remember it's a symbiotic relationship.
it reinforces sexism, does it? Or stereotypes?
Stereotypes in the way that we think about trans people. So elaborate on that. How does that happen? How does that take place, Emma?
I think because trans people have to identify their gender more explicitly to show that they're that gender. So a trans woman, for instance, has to go the extra mile to show that they're a woman. And in order to do that, they pick up the gender stereotypes to prove that they're a woman now. And that, including them in the society, reinforces that they have to do that to be accepted as to who they want to be. I don't know if that's explaining it properly.
Sorry, someone else had wanted.
Yeah, I think the very fact that we have, like when you were saying about identity, gender identity, use the word gender there for gender. I think you can't use gender to say what gender is, gender identity, because the whole concept of gender is rooted in body parts, even though we want to separate them. Where do we get the idea that a man is a man and a woman is a woman? And it's its root. It's the fact that a man has male body parts and a woman has female body parts. And that's where we get the idea of those, of on top of that, then we put gender identity and we then make this social construct based on those body parts. And when a trans person comes along and says, I don't fit into this box and has to go over to the other box, they now reinforce the other box's stereotypes by swapping sides. I don't know if that's part of what you're...
There were two hands. Someone had wanted to say something, either Charity or Blessing, and then Magda.
No, actually, I just wanted to say I had unmuted by mistake.
Oh,
That's
okay.
all.
Magda?
I was thinking, yeah, so you asked how by being transgenders in the society, which is sexist. So because they are kind of like going against the system, what the system does believes to. So I think I forgot my thought. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Once
I
you
maybe come back to it.
yeah, once you remember it, once you remember it, just shout. So I want us to go back to our depiction at when we spoke about someone assigned male at birth, and then this ties to the point that Emma was making. There's another term that we didn't discuss, which was gender expression. So gender expression is when you identify with a gender and then you go on to express that in the way that you, and I'm going to draw a very stereotypical diagram. In the way that you dress, in the way that you behave, in the way that you approach society. So think of your person assigned male at birth, and they recognize that their gender, their self-identity is actually a woman. And so their expression would reflect that of how society has constructed what it means to be woman. And so they put on a dress and they grow out their hair and they behave in the ways in which society, that patriarchy, has determined women behave. Not all trans individuals go on to express themselves in this simplistic structure that I've given. I've just given this one example so that we can see what the problem is in understanding gender this way, and vice versa. When we think of trans men who come to the realization that I identify as a man, I was assigned female at birth, and so I'm going to cut my hair, I'm going to wear trousers, as Natalie put in the chat earlier, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, and etc. And not all trans individuals express themselves this way. I appreciate that. But I think that when we give our examples or our parables, whatever the case is, we can look at the simple illustrations of that thing, and then we can unroot what the problems are with that simple example. So as Emma pointed out, the patriarchy has these categories: male, female, and it has defined what it means to be male and female in a certain way, has put them into these boxes based on the way that you dress, the way that you speak, the way that you engage with the world. That's what it means to be male, and that's what it means to be female. So when someone comes along and doesn't identify with a certain list of characteristics, behaviors, expressions, whatever the case may be, remember the list we used when we defined what identity is, and they say, I identify with these other things. What they're forced to do when they're integrated into this already patriarchal system is go from one label to another. And it goes back to why we define gender in the first place, is when we recognize that it's not this fixed thing. It's socially constructed by a society that is patriarchal and that assigns certain characteristics and behaviors to these labels, male and female, or categories. You're perpetuating the weaknesses or the dangers of integrating trans individuals into the system as a liberal feminist would. Charity and then Natalie. I don't know whose hand was first. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the screen, but yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask a question.
Go for it.
I'm just thinking from the time that people were reading, I was half paying attention, but I kept hearing some things in connection with an emphasis on biology, and of course, there's then the social construct with gender, right? And it just came to my mind that okay, there seems to be a lot of emphasis between these two sides, male or female, right? And I was just wondering then that when it comes to people like the intersex, um, is intersex something we put in the gender bracket or in the, what's the other one?
Sex.
Sex, yes.
So
So
Mhm.
yeah, how do we treat that?
Sure. If we remember how we define sex as being related to physical characteristics at a simple level, that can be your chromosomes, that can be the presence of gonads or ovaries. It's everything physical, tangible. It's that those elements. So if we were to think of intersex, what defines or how do we identify an intersex person? It's based on the physical aspects of them, their chromosomes, their hormones, their sex parts, etc. So that's how you would see intersex people as falling under the bracket of sex, as opposed to this gender, which is it's intangible. It's your self, if I can put it that way, at least how it's defined. Your characteristics, your beliefs, and etc. Those aren't things that you can touch. Does that make sense, Charity? Does that answer your question, please?
It does. I guess I was also asking it with this thought that okay, when it comes to the issue of gender, we spoke about cisgender, we spoke about transgender, right? And then I'm also just thinking about that same person, the intersex, that okay, when it comes to their gender, like where do they fit? Are they cisgender? They can't be transgender, of course. And to me, I guess it basically sort of poses a problem with the idea of how we conceptualize gender itself as a society or as a people, because that means it excludes people who don't fit in that bracket. And if I'm an intersex, then where do I fall under? How do I express myself?
Yeah.
If you understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think we're nicking away or chipping away at the problem, and we're starting to see it. And there's another term that we didn't define, which is non-binary, which would place a third category alongside male and female with regards to gender. Non-binary is that you don't see the world through this binary lens of male and female, and you see yourself, and I'm going to use this term, and then we're going to go after that term, you see gender as belonging on a spectrum. And so you don't see yourself as fitting these binary models of male and female. Instead, you exist somewhere on that spectrum with regards to gender. And so an intersex person may identify as male or female or non-binary, whatever the case may be with regards to these categories that society has constructed. So that's an answer to that question. But then going back to how we understand gender, I don't know if the point that I was trying to put across has made sense or anything. So Blessing and then Natalie.
Wasn't Natalie first?
I don't know. I'm looking at my
I-
list and it shows names
Oh,
in
I think-
order. So I'm going that
I
way.
think she was. I think she raised her hand.
Okay.
Natalie, go ahead.
I don't mind if Blessing goes.
You're already unmuted, so you can go.
Okay. Mine's a bit of a complicated because I can't even articulate it myself. But if there was no such thing as gender construct with behaviours and how you should look and so forth, how would a transgender woman actually they wouldn't feel like obliged, or I mean, maybe some transgender women feel like this is how I have to look, so I have to transition to look like that because that's a social construct of how a woman should look. So if that wasn't the case and that wasn't there, how would a transgender woman express themselves, do you think? If the concept wasn't
I'm
there.
gonna park that if that's okay, and then
Yeah.
I'll get to that how best I see it, at least towards the end, because it plays into the thread that I'm building up. Blessing.
Now that you say what you say, because I'm even afraid of saying what I want to say. Because I might
Okay.
be going ahead of you. So.
Sure. Okay, so I'll hold yours and Natalie's thoughts. I said that I would come to this idea of a gender spectrum, and it's a notion that's presented in society of gender existing outside of these binaries. And so if you don't know what a spectrum is,
Gender inclusive world.
not necessarily. I want to go to the natural first. Oh, nope, not Spectrum magazine. If you don't know what a spectrum is, this is in the natural sense, the literal meaning of what a spectrum is this thing. So if we were to think of colors existing as a spectrum, or light existing as a spectrum, we can see that you go from one wavelength or one end of that spectrum to the other. And as you go from one to the other, is this transition from one color to the next color. There's no hard line demarcation, so to speak, between these colors. It kind of feeds into the next. But a key aspect of this, and what makes it a spectrum, is that there's two opposite ends to it, going from one point in that spectrum to the other point in that spectrum. The reason why I bring this up is because, sorry, could you see my screen there? Yeah, okay. The reason why I bring that up is because when we think about gender as being on a spectrum as well, there's the danger of still reinforcing this idea of a binary that exists on either end of that spectrum, because it implies there's two fixed endpoints, your male on one end and your female on the other. So even if individuals can occupy any position along that spectrum, this framework or this way of looking at it still roots gender identities in this binary system at one end or the other. So by an individual positioning themselves along a spectrum, it suggests that being closer to one end means embodying traits associated with that endpoint, reinforcing traditional gender norms. So going back to our picture of a spectrum, if we were to place male on the far, far left and female at the far, far right, and you were to say, I exist 3/4 of the way to the right, the implication of that is that your characteristics, the way that you identify, exist closer to the traditional model of what it means to be female in the first place. There's a hand that's gone up. I don't know if that's from previous raised hand, Blessing, or a new hand.
Oh yeah, that's from before. I guess I'll raise it later. Sorry.
Sure. So before we go on to the closing thoughts, do people see the problem or the dilemma that we're in with regards to gender, the notion of gender or the concept of gender? And I've gone through the fact that it's a social construct. I've gone through the fact that this social construct has been constructed by a patriarchal society. I've gone through ways in which society thinks they can fight against this construct, and the way that the suggestions that society is offered to fight against this construct is using a metaphor of a spectrum. I've offered reasons why looking at the problem through this way doesn't resolve the problems. And before I get onto resolving that problem, at least do we see the problem?
Yeah.
Or see the issue?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, radical feminism and being trans inclusive. We can't include trans individuals into a system that's already built on a lie, if I can put it that way. That's built on a problem. So how do we resolve it? How do we remain trans inclusive? What does it mean to be inclusive while avoiding the pitfalls of the system that's defined gender, or what gender is, or the whole notion of gender? Natalie, your hand went up, and this may tie to what you had asked, and it may tie to, I suspect, what you were going to say, Blessing. So, Natalie?
What do you want me to
Oh, wait,
answer?
yeah. Sorry, that was your question. So you had asked that question. So,
Yeah.
and I said I'll answer, but I'll let Blessing share his thoughts.
Okay. So what had come to my mind as we were discussing the issue of gender is the idea of society constructing things, or social construct, basically. Rules and norms that are defined by society, by human beings. So first thought that came into my mind, or question rather, was, is it wrong for society to do that? And I guess another thought, okay, maybe besides just wrong, can it be, is it necessary at times? So you mentioned something at some point, I've forgotten which point, and I've also forgotten how exactly you phrased it. But I think it was something along the lines of basically society has to put together, you didn't use the word rules, but I'll use rules because I've forgotten what you said. But they have to put together rules concerning how people view each other and how they interact with each other, how they treat each other. So yeah, so after all of that, I then thought, okay, perhaps the idea of a social construct in and of itself isn't bad, isn't wrong. You could argue it may be necessary, because I don't know, neither would I think that God would, essentially define every single thing about human interactions to us. So human beings have a part to play in regulating their behavior and their interactions, is what I'm saying. So social construct in and of itself, not a bad thing, I think. But gender, of course, I think is definitely a problematic construct made by society, because some things constructed by society are good, some things are really bad and harmful and destructive. So I then started thinking about a study done by Elder Paminda. Was it last year? I think it was last year. Yeah, probably toward the end of last year, when he spoke about what equality looks like. And he started describing the differences in physical characteristics between the sexes. He identified, how he put it was something like, who would move a boulder in the garden? Was it going to be Eve or Adam? And who would reach out to pluck fruit that was higher up? Because Ellen White says Adam was taller, those type of things, slightly taller. And then so after thinking about that study, I then thought, okay, it seems to me that actually constructing the way people interact with each other is unavoidable, if I could say. Because as human beings, we're not all the same. We're different. And because we're different, it would be necessary, I think, and important to define how we view and tackle those differences, basically how we interact with one another. In the face of those, I'll call them obvious differences, right? So you end up having a social construct about people based on their physical differences that actually exist, right? Because as a very simple example, I'm not saying that this is okay. A simple example I'll give is those in our world that are physically bigger or stronger cannot use that to harm those that are not as physically big or physically strong. So that's just one example. I'm trying to simplify it, but I'm just saying it would be necessary for people to know, whether they know it inherently or they have to be educated. I guess since we've experienced sin, definitely we're having to be educated a whole lot more about that. That, you can't use a certain advantage that you seem to have, say physical strength in this case, to hurt someone else. And I'm saying someone because of recognizing that it's not just those that are like male that are necessarily physically big and tall and stuff, because there's a lot of variation between humanity. So I know I've said a lot, but in summary, what I'm basically saying is, firstly, I thought about gender as a social construct. I then thought, okay, we're seeing the damage that gender has done. Does that necessarily mean social constructs are bad? Then I thought social constructs are probably not bad because human beings participate in developing the rules and norms on social interaction, not just the divine, not just God. And therefore, it becomes unavoidable to have those. But the ones that exist currently when it comes to this subject of gender, definitely harmful and destructive. But it seems like we would need to still have a social construct concerning how we interact, because, like I said, in this case, physical differences do exist.
Mhm.
And we need to know how to view those differences and how to treat each other in light of those differences.
Okay. So I think I agree with the sentiments that you've shared, and what I wanted to zone in on is the specific social construct of gender. And as you've pointed out, when we think of what it means to be trans-inclusive, we have to recognize the different constructs that are unnecessary, if I can call it that, as a result of those physical differences that we have in society. That can be a thought or a study for another day of what that involves and what that looks like. But in conclusion, in bringing all these thoughts together and what it means to be a radical feminist and what it means to be trans-inclusive is contrasting it with liberal feminism and this emphasis on including marginalized groups within an existing structure without addressing the deeper issues in those structures. For trans individuals, it means being included in a system that still operates on a patriarchal notion of having gender in the first place. Whereas TERFs seek to fundamentally alter those structures that perpetuate oppression based on a person's sex. So this involves questioning and transforming your societal norms and systems that define and label expression and identity as gendered. If we recall what the very first piece of literature that we were introduced to as a movement in understanding this, it was The Gendered Brain by Gina Rippon. And in that, she makes this argument that the physical differences that men and women have, whether it's the shape of their brains, whether it's the anatomy, all that has little to no effect. I'll go as far as to say no effect on their inner being, their self, their characteristics, their identity as two separate sexes. I'm keeping it at a simple model. And then going back to what that identity is, your characteristics, your beliefs, your expressions, etc. So your physical makeup under that model of a non-gendered brain is not impacted by your physical brain or your hormones and etc. Your character isn't influenced by those aspects of our physicality as men and women. So just drawing down to this final point is that when we think about identity itself as being this makeup of many interacting elements, we have to think of it outside of a gendered model. And so my suggestion, and this, I guess, is if I want to call it the thesis of this argument that we've gone through, is just abolishing the notion of gender as the social construct, recognizing the good that social constructs can do, but looking at this one specific one and seeing the damage that it does to men, to women, to trans men, to trans women, and to everyone in between, in what is expected of them, how they see themselves, how society sees them, and how we interact with all these different varied natures of identity. It just perpetuates, it reinforces, it gives rise to the very thing that we're looking to break apart. The whole notion of a self that aligns with a specific category. How we reconcile a trans individual's internal experience and the way that they see the world and the way that they see themselves is another discussion. I think that we can arrive to that conclusion. We can arrive to understanding trans identity apart from understanding it as being closed in with this notion of gender as a label or as a construct in itself. How we get there is yet to be defined, and we can make steps to get there. But first, we have to recognize the problems in the modeling in the first place. So that brings all the studies that we've done to this conclusion, and seeing how looking at feminism through a radical or liberal lens affects many different aspects of our lives. I won't give a review, because if you want a review, you can go back and watch the previous studies. Let's close in a word of prayer. And we'll also close Sabbath in combination. Dear God, thank you for the many blessings that you've given us as your people. Thank you for teaching us and guiding us about who we are, so that we can have our own self identity as a movement, what our beliefs are. As we investigate the root causes of patriarchy, I pray that you may guide our minds into understanding you better. I can't kneel here and say that I understand everything about our internal beings. I can't, because there's so much I don't know. But there are things that I recognize, that we do recognize, have caused problems in society. And so as we consider the idea of gender or disconnecting it from sex and trying to label them and categorize behaviors, norms, expectations, and etc., I pray that we may be able to recognize that problem while still recognizing the impact that trans individuals have had in this patriarchal system and how we can be inclusive of their experiences. I pray and ask that as we go into a new week and close Sabbath, you may be with us in each of our journeys, in each of the things that we do in this life, recognizing that your coming, your advent is soon, and that the various things that we are doing are preparing us for that timely advent. I thank you and praise your name as always. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Can you stop the recording, please?